I think of Mr. Bungle as my favorite band. They're unpredictable and can be hard to listen to. And sometimes I can't tell if they're joking or creating music that is complex and profound. So if I made a Mr. Bungle documentary, what would it be like? We'll explore that idea, followed by a music theory segment called How to Write Ugly Music, Part 1, Harmonic Dissonance. Understanding is useful, so here we go. I'm Carl King, and this is The Carl King Show, where every week we learn about music, filmmaking, and creativity. If you like this show, head over to patreon.com/Carl King and join for just $1 or $5 a month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my Illusionist $51 level patrons, Hank Howard III, Sean Motley, and Chubode. Quick shout out to my music endorsements, Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ball Strings, Toontrack, and Millennium Media. Now, let's get this episode beginned. Just a few Carl King the Human updates, and then we will officially get beginned. Number one, some of you might remember the Sir Millard Mulch cover of Come Sail Away, which was part of Hemisphere 3 Hermes on the How to Sell album. Well, the lead vocals on it were performed by my very good friend from music college, Dale Lewis. And Dale is suffering from serious health problems, and we are raising funds to get him a mobility scooter. He has devoted his life to helping others, and now he needs our help. So if you can spare a few bucks, I'm putting a GoFundMe link in the show notes. Thank you. Number two, in 2011, I published a sci-fi fantasy short story called Cuyahoga, and it's been on Amazon Kindle all these years, but I decided to share it as a PDF download for all of my Patreon members. It was written during a dark time in my life when I was experiencing social paranoia and constant panic attacks. Adam, the main character, faces those things in a supernatural form. So head over there to my Patreon to read it. And now let's move on to this week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week. This week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week is something a little different because it's a film that doesn't exist and probably never will. I think of Mr. Bungle as my favorite band. They're unpredictable and can be hard to listen to because they blend total chaos with virtuosity. So sometimes I can't tell if they're just joking or creating music that is complex and profound. Back when I cared about making documentaries, I had the urge to make one about them, and I'm glad I didn't try. I doubt it could ever happen because I would want strict control over it, and I'd need to be paid $250,000 minimum. It's not that I'm greedy or that I'm that good at making documentaries. It's just that it would require me to take 2 weeks off from this very profitable YouTube channel. Also, I'm too old to get pushed around by musicians, and I'm sure they wouldn't cooperate or answer any of my questions. But as a thought experiment, what would that imaginary Carl King, Mr. Bungle documentary even be? Well, if I had to decide right now, I would focus on the creation of a new Mr. Bungle proper song. To my knowledge, it would be the first in 24 years. And my filmmaking process would not only document, but also influence the music. As director, I would demand the following musical constraints. Number one, the band must reunite what Trevor calls Mr. Bungle proper. And that would be Trevor, Mike, Trey, and the return of Danny and Bear. Number two, those 5 guys would live and work together in a large recording studio. We'd film them during their waking hours, like that Metallica Black Album documentary. For the sake of a linear narrative and a ticking clock, the band would have only 1 week to collaboratively write and record a new, original Mr. Bungle song from scratch. And I say collaboratively because it couldn't be one of those deals where Trey, Trevor, or Mike writes a song and the others play it. I'd want to see them creating it together. Number 3, the song must not contain more than 10% metal or anything resembling their recent album, The Raging Wrath of the Easter Bunny demo. But they could work with any other genre, or genres, and play any instruments they'd like. Number 4, I would require them to notate all of the music and provide an analysis using their best understanding of music theory. Number 5, at the end of the week, they would record the song together live in the studio. And they'd be allowed as many complete takes as they want, but no punching in or overdubs would be allowed. No editing and no guest musicians. Now, since they're known for such elaborate post-production, we should change things up and focus on the raw sound of Mr. Bungle proper playing music in a room. And finally, number 6, the song's lyrics and abstract theme must be about a documentary of their choice. It could be any documentary, domestic or foreign. Some examples could be Grey Gardens or Sherman's March or American Movie or whatever their favorite obscure documentary might be. And they could even make it a self-reference about this very Mr. Bungle documentary and title it Documentary, although I suspect they would translate it into another language, maybe French or Italian or Latin. Now, I'm sure Mr. Bungle fans would object to such a strict process. Like, who is this guy with the big forehead and the influencer glasses squashing my favorite band's creativity, telling them what they can and can't do? Well, my argument is this. Mr. Bungle can get a job like the rest of us. And hey, it's only for 1 week. Of course, the band would never agree to any of this anyway. Their ethic is all about artistic freedom and contrarianism. But in that same spirit, I think a Mr. Bungle documentary should be contrary to Mr. Bungle. And that would be easy to achieve if I were the director, because the guys in Mr. Bungle just don't care about the same things that I do, and neither do their fans. First of all, the band values being mysterious, both personally and musically. So my documentary would aim to destroy that mystery. We'd see right there on camera how they come up with their musical ideas, how they communicate, how they rehearse, and how they sound when rehearsing. Second, I'm a pretty big reductionist and musical atheist. Most people believe that music has a magical dimension that can't be measured or explained. But I don't think music, or any art, is anything beyond its material components. So I'd be there annoying everyone by constantly turning the topic back to music theory. Along with the let's write a song narrative, there would of course be interviews, but I would skip all of the typical biographical Wikipedia type stuff. Because I don't care where they grew up, what year it was, the list of albums they made, or who else they played with. There's no need to waste time on all those facts. I'd get right into the conceptual stuff, psychologically interrogating the band members, starting with, number 1, that whole audience torture thing. Most bands don't do that, but most bands aren't Mr. Bungle. Performers typically need the audience to like them, or they quickly find themselves out of a job. However, Mr. Bungle got signed to a major label, but didn't seem to take it seriously. Anyone else their age would have said, all right, this is our big break. But as we know, Mr. Bungle were contrarians. Their showmanship was more like anti-showmanship. There were long sets of feedback and random cover songs no one wanted to hear. They created a dissonant experience, not only with their choice of musical notes, but in their relationship with the audience, especially during the Disco Volante tour. I would want to know, what were they thinking at the time? How did they talk about it? And what are some of the memorable ways that they tortured the audience? Did they think that that stuff was funny? And were they trying to challenge the definition of what a show is? Number 2, their music industry context. In the early 90s, pre-internet, music was still distributed through mainstream corporate channels like MTV and commercial radio. So when I grew up in small-town Florida, it was hard to find stuff that wasn't part of that formula. It felt like only 10 bands were allowed to exist at any time, and it was those few who were funded and promoted by having a big hit. So no big hit, no visibility. Now, because Faith No More had a big hit with Epic, Mr. Bungle snuck through the delivery system. They were sort of a gateway drug that introduced kids like me to more possibilities. And Frank Zappa was a parallel to that. But what those artists did musically wasn't itself original or new. They mostly combined diverse influences. Like, for example, Frank Zappa is like Stravinsky plus blues guitar plus 50s doo-wop. But that was rare within the context of the early 90s. All of the horizontal genre hopping also was not new. So would they be willing to acknowledge that and dispel the myth as humble, normal adults, which I think they might be now? I'd ask them to debunk their musical genius status, meaning since they can probably name their direct influences on a piece-by-piece basis, do they feel they have gotten too much credit for being unique and original? And would they agree that all innovators in music are overrated? And is all music more similar than different? Number 3, music versus noise. Mr. Bungle's music, especially Disco Volante, can function as an introduction to avant-garde and 20th century classical music techniques. So I'd ask them to name some of those techniques and how they used them to test the boundaries between music and noise. I would ask them their thoughts on the following concept. If you go around a circle to the right, you have complexity, like prog rock and guitar shredding. And if you go around a circle to the left, you have noise, like musique concrète. At some point, those two things kind of blur into each other and become the same thing. Were they conscious of doing that? I'd also ask them about some of their specific choices. For instance, the drumming on Platypus. The OU818 demo version was super tight and precise, but the Disco Volante version was all over the place. The drums were speeding up and slowing down around the song, and there was a lot of fooling around. Did anyone in the band consider that they might be ruining the song, or did they think it was funny? Did everyone agree on that direction? The previous album was almost proggy in its precision, so did they want to rebel against that? Number 4, Trevor and Trey's classical and jazz education in college. I'd get those two guys in a room with a record player and listen to and talk about maybe half a dozen pieces of music that influenced them in their college days. Maybe Ligeti, Bernard Herrmann, and Stravinsky. It seems like parts of Travolta with its minor major 7 chords were straight up horror music played by a rock band. And not that many use that tonality. Or are they aware of rock bands who have? And what did the original version of A Walk Through Necropolis sound like when it was composed for a jazz big band? I'd ask them to name specific examples of compositional techniques they learned from other composers during those college years. I'd say, now let's listen to them on camera and show me where you used those techniques in your own music. Number 5, Trevor's wrong note jazz. I'd ask him to demonstrate his odd melody note choices where he places dissonant notes in the vocals. For example, retro vertigo. On a related Trevor topic, how much of the band's path was determined by Trevor? I think he designed their logo and even named the band. So is he seen as sort of the unofficial band leader or manager? And would anyone in the band think of it that way? Or are they truly a 3 or 5-way democracy? Is there any disagreement there on how that works? Number 6, Mike Patton's cognitive understanding of music. Does he genuinely have perfect pitch, as Trevor claimed? I would sit him down at a piano and force him to explain his mental modality for music. If he doesn't use music theory, what is his internal understanding of it? Does he see shapes or intervals? Then I would play some consonant chords and have him sing dissonant non-chord tones. And then I'd play some dissonant chords and ask him to write a melody around it. And we would talk about his choice of intervals and add a harmony. How is he doing that internally? And how well can he distinguish the notes in polychords? Anyway, that would be the only segment focused on Mike Patton. Number 7 would be Trey's symbolism and musical quotations. For instance, why does he not credit the original composer for parts of Mamishka Moskwa's? And are there other instances of musical quotations in his music? I think there probably are. Does he have a photographic memory? And how does he store that much information? Was he able to do that from a young age? Number 8 would be neurodivergence. Are there any traits of autism or ADHD among the band members? What are their personality types or temperaments? Are there any extremes? Are they introverts versus extroverts? And even how do they annoy each other? Why is it hard for creative people like them to be in a band? Number 9, what are their thoughts on obscurity? Do they want to be obscure in some ways? And why do they make difficult listening music? Do they believe that improves the experience of art for the in-crowd? And number 10, I would investigate and feature some surprising details about Danny and Bear. They don't get enough credit or attention. So what are the major specific things they have contributed? So there it is, the pitch for my imaginary Mr. Bungle documentary that I'll never need to make. Because honestly, why go through all the trouble? Why ask some obscure musician dudes questions that they don't want to answer? I already know that documentaries are way too much work, so I can't wait to not watch it. And more importantly, to not edit it. So since I didn't need to do anything except think about it, I gave this film 5 out of 5 stars and a little heart on Letterboxd. And now let's move on to this week's analytical music theory analysis of the week. In this week's analytical music theory analysis of the week, we will explore how to make ugly music, part 1, Harmonic Dissonance. If you are into metal or horror film score music, I'm about to share some tips for writing music that is full of unpleasant chords. But first, a disclaimer. I am not a professional scientist, so beware of any claims I make regarding physics. And remember, half the stuff I say on this show is a lie. We'll start with just a single musical note. That's an A, and it has a frequency of 440 hertz. That's 440 sound waves going into your ear per second. And here's another note. That is another A, an octave up. It has a frequency that is double the other A. This one is 880 hertz. That's 880 sound waves going into your ear per second. If we combine two musical notes, we have what is called an interval. and that's the distance between those notes. Snobby guitarists like to call it a dyad, as in utilizing a dyad. I'd rather call it a 2-note chord, or even a double stop if I have to. Now, the sound that two combined notes make is determined by whether their fundamental frequencies and overtones reinforce or interfere with each other, and by how much. When I play that first A note at 440 Hertz, together with an A note an octave above it at 880 Hertz, those frequencies are reinforced and sound harmonious because they are a simple 2-to-1 ratio. 880 divided by 2 is 440. The second note is a simple doubling of the frequency of the first note. And you can see where their peaks line up with those lines every other time. The notes are not clashing and not ugly. Because of the math, our ears say, hey, those sounds go together. They fit together nicely. They're stable rhythms. We hear that interval as consonants, but you and I are here for the dissonance, so let's make some. Instead, if I play an A at 440 Hertz and add a B flat at 466.16 Hertz, that's only 1/2 step above it, that's a far more complex ratio, approximately 1.05946 to 1. Notice how many decimal places there are there. 1.05946. It's not simple like 2-to-1. To get that 466.16 Hertz, we need to multiply our original 440 Hertz by 1.05946. And you can see here at the red circles, the waveforms no longer line up. They're close, but they rub against each other as if they're out of tune. There is a lot of interference, and our ears detect that as dissonance. When the frequencies are out of sync like that, it creates an ugly buzzing or beating sound. But remember, these waves are happening super fast. They're going in and out of sync hundreds of times per second. It's like two cars going around a racetrack at only slightly different speeds. So at some point, they'll appear to be in sync, but then go out of sync again. And you can hear the dissonance more prominently if you drop that minor second down a few octaves. Hear that wobbling? That's because the interference pattern is slower in that range, where we can perceive it. But in this case, on this A note at 55 Hertz, the waveform oscillates at 55 times per second, and the B flat is at 58.27 Hertz. The cycles are too fast for us to consciously distinguish, so I suspect those slow wobbles we hear are only the interference pattern on top of the fundamental frequencies. And if we move it up a few octaves, the interference pattern becomes faster. It's more difficult to detect that wobble, so we can get away with using more dissonant intervals in higher frequency ranges. That is, if we wanted to avoid dissonance for some reason, which we don't. So first tip, play dissonant intervals in a lower range. Now, here's some math, which I'm not good at. Each of the 12 intervals in the chromatic scale has its own mathematical ratio, creating its own amount of dissonance. An octave is 2-to-1. A fifth is 3-to-2. A fourth is 4-to-3. A major third is 5-to-4. A minor third is 6-to-5. A major sixth is 5-to-3. A minor sixth is 8-to-5. A minor seventh is 9-to-5. A major second is 9-to-8. And a major seventh is 15-to-8. Now, the minor second is tricky because some say it's 16-to-15, and some say it's 1.05946 to 1, as I showed before. But those are complex ratios within just a few cents of each other, so it's hard to tell. And the tritone is another oddity. Some say the ratio is 64 to 45, and some say it's 45 to 32. Now, which one is correct? We don't know yet. I wasn't able to find a definitive scientific answer within a reasonable amount of time, and most people will never hear the difference. They're both such dissonant intervals, even when perfectly in tune. So I welcome you to research the scientific basis of minor seconds and tritones and share your discoveries as a comment. But it does seem that the greater the ratios, the more ugly the dissonance. And a similar pattern seems to exist in polyrhythms, but that would be rhythmic dissonance. And that's a subject for another time. Now, so far, we are talking about pure intervals based on the overtone series that exists in nature. But in Western music, we use a system called equal temperament because it turns out that using those pure intervals is too tricky. Our pianos and guitars would need way too many in-between notes to hit all of those exact frequencies. So to keep it simple and get the job done, we use equal temperament. And from this point on, in this video, I'm going to refer to equal temperament intervals. In his textbook, 20th Century Harmony, Vincent Persichetti divides those equal temperament intervals into categories based on how ugly they sound. Perfect fifths and octaves are called open consonances. Major thirds, minor thirds, major sixths, and minor sixths are soft consonances. Minor seconds and major sevenths are called sharp dissonances. Major seconds and minor sevenths are called mild dissonances. The perfect fourth is either consonant or dissonant, and I'm not sure why, and the tritone is considered ambiguous and can be either neutral or restless. And that's surprising because tritones are very dissonant, very ugly. I think Persichetti must have had his own subjective taste for dissonance. So maybe we need to turn back to standard classical harmony for answers. According to Roger Kamian, the equal temperament intervals are divided into categories like so. Octaves, perfect fourths, and perfect fifths are perfect consonances. By the way, this is probably why we call them perfect fourths and perfect fifths. In equal temperament tuning, they have the smallest discrepancies from their counterparts in the overtone series. For example, perfect fifths are only about 2 cents away from being in perfect tune. But other intervals are made more dissonant because of equal temperament tuning, especially major thirds, but that's another confusing topic. He then categorizes major seconds, minor sevenths, major thirds, minor sixths, minor thirds, and major sixths as imperfect consonances. And finally, tritones, minor seconds, and major sevenths are called perfect dissonances. Paul Hindemith, a German composer from the 18 and 1900s, also categorized those three as the most dissonant intervals. So if you want to create some ugly music, your best bet is to focus on tritones, major sevenths, and minor seconds. Now we know, from a scientific perspective, why metal and horror film scores emphasize these intervals. But I do think that metal music has a long way to go before catching up, since the most common interval used there is perfect fifths, also known as power chords. And we know from science, those are simply too consonant. So here are my 5 recommendations for metal musicians who want their chords to be more ugly. Number 1, stop using any intervals that are consonant. No more power chords, okay? Only use minor seconds, tritones, and major sevenths. Number 2, avoid playing more than 2 notes of a dissonant chord per instrument. So if you have a 3-note chord, put 2 notes on the guitar and 1 on the bass. And no doubling, meaning have the bass guitar play its own ugly note that isn't played on the guitar. You can also try it a minor second or a tritone away. Number 3, too many notes on a single instrument, especially a distorted guitar, can weaken its ugliness, making the sound too thick and opaque. The more ugly notes you add to a single voice, the weaker those individual dissonances can become, because it turns into mush. And we want those ugly notes to have nowhere to hide. Number 4, you can also hard pan the musical voices. You can put a tritone interval on the hard left and a minor second hard right. It's good to give them some space so you can hear all of that wobbling. Show off those wrong notes with proud clarity. As my music theory teacher, Mrs. Lawler, once said, strident ugliness. And number 5, when all else fails, play out of tune. That's a quick way to add dissonance to any interval, even one that is considered consonant. Okay, that's the end of this episode of The Carl King Show. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or anywhere else you consume these dang episodes. And if you like this show, support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my $51 a month patrons at the Special Illusionist level, Chubode, Sean Motley, and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for joining me. And as I always say, I hate editing video.